What do Siberians wear in the summer? They unbutton their fur coats. Hi, welcome to Russian History of Russia. My name is Asya and this is part 2 of the Siberia bonus episode, so if you haven't seen the previous one, I would suggest going back and watching that first. There we cut off just about getting into the actual history of Siberia before the Russians got there, and of course the Mongols who got there first during Genghis Khan's era.
And that's why it's so fun to study history of Russia.
So prior to the 13th century, Siberia was populated by many tribes, ethnicities, and cultures sprouting from Scythian, Turkic, and other proto-groups. Some of the largest early settler groups on the Siberian plateau were supposedly pushed out north by the ancient nomadic Chinese Empire. Since farming wasn't a great option even in the 20th century, as we have already established, you can imagine that Siberian inhabitants of the Bronze Age and early medieval period were mostly semi-nomadic cultures heavily dependent on fishing, hunting, and herding. These include Yenets, Nenets, Yenisei Kyrgyz, Samoyeds, Evenks, Yakut, and many other. The diversity of languages and cultures was huge, but the overall population remained really small. In fact, according to the estimates, by the time Russians began their conquests in 16th, 17th centuries, there was just about 200,000 people living in all of Siberia. That's the population of one city of London in 1600. For another comparison, pre-Columbian population of North America is estimated in millions, from 2 million to as much as 18. Central areas of Siberia were a part of other major civilizations/empires twice before the Russians got there. First, the predecessor of the Mongolian Empire, the Great Turkic Khanate in 6th-7th centuries, when it was actually one of the biggest empires to ever exist, and then of course the Mongolian Empire. Genghis Khan conquered southern Siberia in 1206, and his son Jochi added some more Taiga tribes later. Posts for tax collection and new trade routes were established, and written Chinese and Mongolian sources provide us with those bits of information that we do have besides the archaeological evidence. But the vastness of these lands, low population density, and not so friendly climate didn't make it a very high priority for anyone. In the northwest, however, Novgorod Republic made contact with the local tribes, later to be known as Yugra, that lived around the Ural Mountains and established trade with them around 11th century. Novgorod later expanded their influence and even rule on them as well. The southwest of Siberia saw the rise and fall of several nomadic state entities that I covered throughout the series, including the Tatars, who were originally overrun by the Mongols, but then sort of like became the Mongols, merging with the mutating empire and pretty much forming Golden Horde and other khanates that the empire gave birth to. One of such khanates was the Khanate of Sibir or Sibir, emerging around 15th century and located somewhere around Irtysh and Ob rivers. However, when it comes to Siberia, borders are a very vague concept. Like on the maps, they would just use this kind of soft brush to show the general vicinity rather than firm borders. Sibir was a multi-ethnic entity ruled by more descendants of Genghis Khan, and also the most northern Muslim state ever, since they sprouted from the Golden Horde, which had converted to Islam in the 14th century. The ruling class of Sibir Khanate inherited the religion as well. Sibir Khanate existed until 1580s, when the Russian conquest of Siberia had kicked off, and its territory eventually became the base of operations for this venture east. Huge role in the conquest of Siberia was played by the Cossacks. In fact, this conquistador I showed you before, Yermak, was a Cossack. Originally, they were either Slavic or Tatar Orthodox semi-military military muscle for hire that essentially evolved into a separate social class and eventually, highly argued and contested, into a separate nationality that still exists in modern Russia and Ukraine with some level of autonomy. I am not going to dive too deep into this highly flammable and complex subject, but Cossacks as a self-identity has existed for at least 8 centuries, and it was the Cossacks who did the majority of Siberia conquering business in the beginning, even if it was in the name of Russian Tsardom. So in 1547, Ivan IV, the terrible one, became the ruler and the first Tsar of Russia, something I still have yet to cover in the main Russian history of Russia. Ivan's forces defeated the Khanate of Kazan, and that pushed Russian borders all the way to the Ural Mountains, and Russian migrants began moving out east and establishing new settlements. However, the Stone Belt or the Iron Gates, aka the Ural Mountains, were the great barrier for any further expansion. They are what divides Europe and Asia, ranging from the Arctic to the modern-day Kazakhstan. They are not the tallest in the world by far, but they are enough to pose a problem for people who did not yet have helicopters or railroads at least. Furthermore, as soon as you crossed, you ended up in Sibir Khanate, which put it next in line on Russia's expansionist agenda. In 1555, Ivan IV made then Khan of Sibir his vassal and was collecting tribute from him. But in 1573, after that Hun was overthrown, the new Hun refused to pay, and his son dared to disturb the newly established estate of the Stroganov nobles in the Ural Mountains region. If you ever had a beef stroganoff, you probably know the name. To protect their assets, Stroganovs hired a group of Cossacks led by our friend Yermak. Yermak conquered Sibir Khanate in the name of Russia, dying in the process. And by the end of the 16th century, Russian Tsardom founded several towns here that became its gateway into the vastness lying beyond, including the city of Tobolsk, the capital of Siberia for the following couple of centuries, the starting point for all the migrants and exiles into Siberia from the Russian Empire, and the final stop for the last Russian Tsar, Nikolai II, and his family, after he was overthrown in the Russian Revolution of the 1917. He was kept in Tobolsk under house arrest before eventually being executed. The 17th century exploration period was very slow, partially due to the political turmoil in Russia itself, as well as the unfriendly wilderness and landscape that they had to fight through. The Cossacks and other explorers were coming in through the southwest, and the northern Russian settlers were coming through the Arctic Ocean when it was navigable in summers. The only sensible way to get around Siberia was, for the longest time, rivers. Siberia has several massive rivers like Yenisei, Ob, and Lena, with their respective river systems forming a network that determined the routes of exploration for Russian frontiersmen. Slow but steady, they traveled and mapped those rivers, fighting and trading with the locals, and establishing river forts called Ostrog. Ostrog is how most Siberian towns had begun, including my hometown Irkutsk, with the area of Angara River explored in 1643 by the Cossacks, and the Ostrog founded here by another famous Russian explorer, Ivan Pakhabov, a bit later in 1661. In 1822, Irkutsk even became the second capital when Siberia was divided into 2 administrative parts, east and west, with centers in Irkutsk and Tobolsk, respectively. I'm sure back then, when those settlers and explorers were moving further and further from their homes east, Siberia seemed like it would just never end, until it finally did in the Pacific coast. By 1648, explorer merchants Popov and Dezhnev reached, and Dezhnev supposedly even crossed, the Bering Strait between modern-day Russia and Alaska. Although from 1733 to 1867, Alaska was called Russian America, and it was a part of Russia until it started to run low on fur, and Russians kind of lost interest, and it was sold to the United States of America for $7.2 million, which would be about $125 million in today's money. I looked it up. There are single-family homes in California that cost more than that. Anyway, at the time, they stopped at the Pacific, and by 1680s, the borders of Russia, or at least its Asian part, began to take pretty much the exact same shape it is today, with the exception of Kamchatka, which will only be covered in the early 18th century. That doesn't mean the region was immediately populated by Russians. That process will take centuries of migration waves, exiles, and of course 20th century forced relocations and labor camps, but we'll cover that separately when we get to the history of the Soviet Union. Ultimately, if I had to provide a general description for who eventually populated Russian Siberia, I would say those who had no place in the West. Many were convicts and exiles, others opportunists. Those were the people working the mines and building the roads and fortifications against the remaining resistance, which was mostly in the steppe region. In 1760, a new law allowed the landowners to send those serfs that they basically just didn't like to Siberia, and those souls would be counted as recruits, something the landowners owed to the government either way, but we'll again cover that in the main course. 100 years later, the Emancipation of Serfs reform of 1861 created another wave of migrants, this time the ones that left their landlords voluntarily and moved in search for better life. But still, mostly because their original life in the West sucked that much for them. That included a lot of serfs from Russia's bread lands in the south, including today's Ukraine and Belarus. Administrative and governing jobs here were often some sort of a punishment too, or a temporary career move, but ultimately it meant somebody somewhere really wanted to get rid of you. 19th century uprisings in Russia and Poland enriched Siberia with political exiles, in some cases some of the smartest and best educated people of their time. That sparked some intellectual life in Siberian urban centers, laying the foundation for future not even so bad universities and schools. But of course, nothing changed Siberia as much as the Trans-Siberian Railway did at the turn of the century. The journey that used to take months was now just a week or two, which meant transporting perishable goods, more efficient governing, taxation, and of course much higher chances of you, your family, and your kids not dying on the road from starvation and disease and meteor strike and all the other typical Siberian dangers. As a result, population of Siberia almost tripled in just the first couple of decades. New industry was popping up. Technological advancements in mining and processing meant finally tapping into those sweet underground treasures and not just washing gold, although that at the time was pretty cool too. So by the 20th century, Siberia began to become less impossible and inconceivable and more just challenging and often misunderstood. And that is all for my Siberian interlude. I hope you found it interesting and informative, and if you have any suggestions for more bonus topics on Russia, like, I don't know, art, culture, food, anything really, feel free to suggest that in the comments, and I will see you back in the main history episodes. Bye!